Well, if you've been complaining that you haven't seen much fiscal responsibility out of the Trump administration, perhaps I've got good news for you. Hi, I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. And men, this past week or so, President Trump sent a note over to Congress saying, cancel the 2.1% civilian pay increase for 2019. In addition, he also canceled what they call a locality pay increase, which is a much bigger boost, actually, for federal government employees who live in expensive places like, let's say some areas of California. As a little research on this turns up, actually, California is the hub of federal government workers. There are more federal government workers in California than in any other state. Virginia is second, Washington, D.C. third, Texas.
Yay,
so right here on your screen, we've got California and Texas represented. I don't know where Colorado is on the list. But Stephen Green, as much as many fans of the Trump administration may have good things to say about what he has done so far, it's been kind of a quiet issue, this whole budget issue. And if anything, we've heard that he boosted the budget, the defense budget rather, yeah. And the military is scheduled to get, I think it's a 2.6% pay increase next year. But now he's saying no pay raise for civilian government employees in 2019. Steve, how is the federal government going to be able to recruit and retain the best and brightest to do the important work of the federal government without being able to offer competitive pay and a growth path for the future?
Well, number one, they don't. Number two, they shouldn't. I want a bunch of unimaginative dolts working for the federal government. I'm only half joking.
Your wish has been granted.
I'm not even half joking here. I'm deadly serious here. The problem is you get these progressives with these grand schemes, these huge designs on how to pound every square peg into every round hole. And they've got all this money and they've got all this power and they're going to do it. No, the trade-off used to be you work for the federal government. Okay, you didn't make much money, but you couldn't be fired. Now these guys get their annual pay raises. They get their cost of living adjustments for living in expensive places. You know, we shouldn't have federal workers that are able to afford expensive places, period. That should be part of the deal. You can't get fired, but you don't get much pay. And here's what's happened. Here's why they can lord it over us the way they do, especially when you get to these top-level feds, and I'm talking about James Comey and all the rest, is not only are they unfireable, but they also can't be held account legally for the damn stupid illegal things they do in and out of office, and they get fantastic pay on top of all of that. So if you want to know why federal employees so often seem to feel so entitled, it's because we've made them into a privileged class, Scott. Now, you got to cut their salaries to the bone. I know there are a lot of federal workers out there who just, working stiffs, whatever. That's fine. But everyone from, maybe '09 or '10 up, cut their pay to the bone. Don't give them cost of living adjustments for anything, and make them work for a living. This is just sad that such a rich and productive people haven't had a real pay raise in almost 20 years, while Washington just gets fatter and fatter.
Now, Bill Whittle, President Trump did send this note over to Congress telling him that his intention was to cut this pay raise. But ultimately, Congress holds the purse strings. Trump is saying that he has the executive authority to command this by dint of the fact that we have a national emergency, a budgetary emergency. But Bill, out of the other side of his mouth, President Trump is saying our economy is booming. We got a 4.1% GDP growth. Things are going great in this country. If you were a betting man, do you think that the Republicans in Congress are going to pass a budget that cuts the pay or refuses to increase the pay, rather, of federal civilian workers? And do you think President Trump should be able to make both arguments, that it's a national emergency and things are booming and going great?
Well, there's a bunch of different issues here. So let's deal with the national emergency one first. The one thing I want to do less than anything in the world is define down emergency as a means to spend or not spend money. You know, I mean, that's the last thing we want to do, because then there's an education emergency, and then there's a there's a war on boredom, and then there's all kinds of other things that suddenly become
We're doing our best in that war.
Federally mandated projects. So let's just get away from that. The Congress has the power to pass legislation. The president has the power to sign it into law or veto it as he chooses. Let's just stick with that. That's a pretty good plan. I think the solution to this issue is that the founders had put together an extraordinarily effective way to channel people's personal desire for personal success, enrichment, and all the rest of it, power, whatever you want to call it. Selfishness, personal selfishness, designed it into the economy and the government in such a way that by the act of a normal businessman wanting to become rich, he has to become rich by voluntarily convincing his fellow citizens to part with sums of money to him, at which point he will be doing better, but he'll also have done better for everybody because he's provided services to the entire community. And that's not just a theory, that's how it actually works. So you have a problem now when you have people with that kind of ambition in the government, because they're not providing a particular service that generates any new wealth. They're simply redistributing wealth that's already been generated by other people. That's number one. And number two, they have the force of law behind them. They don't have to deal with competition. They're the government. You don't get to go to another government if you don't like the way you're being handled here. So I think that I'm serious about this. I think the solution to this is to go back to the original idea of the founders and the original idea of Adam Smith and capitalism. And that is, let's not pretend that human nature is something that it's not. Let's understand that people go into business for personal betterment and people go into government for personal betterment. There are people who would rather do it through a bureaucracy than do it in open competition. That's their business. I have no problem with that. So I think seriously what we should do is we should tie the wages of federal employees into what the economy is doing. If they vote themselves a lot of taxes so that the economy slows down to 1%, they make less money. If, on the other hand, they decide to hold off on this out of the selfishness of wanting to take home more money themselves, and the economy grows because the regulations are lowered or limited, then they make more money and everybody's happy. So I say, let's just get them pulling on the same rope as all the rest of us are, because they are. They're pulling on the rope of self-interest. But right now the system is set up so that their self-interest and our self-interest are just diametrically opposed to each other. It benefits them to raise taxes and give themselves automatic pay raises. If their raises were tied to the state of the economy, then it would benefit them to get as much out of the way as possible.
Yeah. Oh, hey, Scott, can I throw something in? I just realized I misspoke on something. When I was talking about pay grades, I used the military officer 09, 010. I should have used GS, of course, which is civilian grades.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I was going to mention that.
I didn't mean to imply.
Except that I'm not smart enough to have known it.
Well, there are some sticklers for detail on the internet.
That's good.
One
That's
or
good.
two.
They'll fact check your tale. So, anytime this kind of suggestion is made that we might be able to restrain a pay increase or even cut pay, I've seen this by my own experience in local government. There are two arguments that are made contrary to that. One is the devastating effect of that pay decrease or leveling or freeze, for example. The other is that it doesn't have any effect whatsoever. And so you'll hear the same people making the same one argument. They go, oh my goodness, you can't cut the pay. It's going to be devastating. And it won't have any effect anyway. So, so you literally can't cut a nickel from a budget without hearing both of those arguments, how tragic it would be if you were to do so and how it wouldn't actually accomplish anything. And so you're going to hear that same argument here. If I had to be a betting man, I would say that the Republicans in Congress, unless a strong Republican majority comes in the November election, and I think this vote may happen before that because they're working on putting together a budget package right now. But Republicans in Congress will not support the president's effort to cap that or to keep the increases from happening. It's just been my historical experience to see that's how it happens. But my overall concern in this is, once again, we are getting distracted from what's really important. If Republicans are ever going to make a systemic, lasting change in the deficit and the debt situation, they're going to have to address systemic issues. They're going to have to ask big questions. And that's their job. If you see Congress as kind of a board of directors that's responsible for setting overall policy, and they're not the executive branch, their overall policy ought to be, how can we make sure that the federal government is doing only that which the federal government must do, and is doing it at the most efficient and effective way possible, at the lowest price possible. And that's the kind of sweeping questions they need to be asking. What can we push down to the state levels? What can we push down? And I don't mean channeling money from the states through the federal government back to the states. I mean, how can we devolve authority back to the lowest level possible, to the individual, to the family, to the township, to the county, to the state? And then how can we, so basically divesting the federal government of the massive expenses. And I think it was Steve that gave me a great idea, or maybe it was Bill. If these folks are living in these high cost locales, well, maybe we need to start breaking up the federal government agencies and putting them into low income neighborhoods. You know, there's a lot of land in Detroit, I think, that would have a nice little series of federal government offices could go in some of those areas that have been essentially plowed under in Detroit. They don't need to all be concentrated in wealthy areas like the 7 most expensive zip codes in the country in and around Washington, D.C. That I think, when we start asking questions as conservatives, as Republicans, as libertarians, as classical liberals, we start asking these questions about what is the fundamental nature of the federal government and how can we make sure it is doing that and only that, then I think we dig into the marrow, the important issues, and we get back to some of what Bill was referring to as what the framers' intent for this governmental structure was at the beginning. And then I think we don't have to argue about the little, 2.1% here and 2.1% there, because there won't be that many people getting a pay increase at all. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.